Hey guys, here with another one take review. Today I wanted to talk about the most recent Mitski album, Laurel Hell. And Mitski is normally a pretty well-respected artist, all things considered, but I did notice that there was some divide in her fan base when the singles for this album were coming out anyway. It's sort of just a very different direction for Mitski artistically from that indie rock that she's normally known for and the art pop, art rock that she was sort of going for on Be the Cowboy a few years back. And overall, I think that this was at least an interesting direction for her to go in. Like I said, Mitski is probably one of the most well-respected artists in indie rock and indie pop music in recent years, both from her fan base and from critics, and even from her influences. I mean, I think, if I recall correctly, I think Iggy Pop actually had said something pretty positive about Mitski's music at one point. So she's just an all-around very respected individual in the music industry. And I think one of the reasons for that is that she's always been fairly unique while also never being totally avant-garde as well. I mean, a lot of her earlier works like Bury Me at Makeout Creek, which is fantastic, fantastic album, kind of mixed together that Americana and indie rock and the indie folk all together into a sound that was uniquely hers, but also kind of was able to be marketed towards a larger audience until I believe it was 2018's Be the Cowboy, where she started to go into more of an art pop direction. And once again, Laurel Hell sees Mitski just totally switch things up with it being a very synthesizer based synth pop kind of album. To be honest, the synths on here kind of have a 50-50 shot at working or not working. Some songs utilize them perfectly. You've got songs like the album closer, That's Our Lamp. I personally think that song utilizes the synth very well. But at the same time, there are just some songs on here that are actually good and would have been just much better off without the synths. And even though I do appreciate this new direction that Mitski is going in, and I think that she executed it well enough for a first go at it, I do think that there are some songs here that would have been better reserved for a more traditional Mitski indie rock, art pop kind of style. Anything but synth pop is basically what I'm trying to say. So she does execute the style well, but she certainly hasn't mastered it. I will say that much. Although Mitski is definitely dipping her toes into new water with Laurel Hell, I do think that at the core of this record is the same Mitski style that we've all kind of grown to know and love, and that style is, of course, clinical depression in a good way. In a good way. I mean, come on, come on. But no, really though, I do think that behind the walls of synths and sort of synth pop revival production, I do think that there is that classic poet's melancholy that's been deeply rooted in even Mitski's most musically upbeat moments, and I do think that that goes well with that synth pop style. That's a very nighttime in the city kind of sound that a lot of similar artists have tried to capture, like The Weeknd on After Hours, and similar artists have tried to capture with a darker side of synth pop music. And I think a very small handful have been able to properly achieve that, but I will say I do think Mitski is now officially one of them, even if I'm not the biggest fan of this album. As far as vocal work goes, I do think that the instrumentals here fit Mitski's voice pretty well overall. I do think that there were some missed opportunities here, though, for Mitski to kind of change her style up slightly and maybe go with more of that synth flow that has defined this new sound of hers. I mean, really, for as strong of a vocalist as Mitski actually is, this record does kind of sound like an indie rock singer that was just forcibly given a synth pop, synthy instrumental from their label or their manager and told to just run with it. For the most part, anyway, I would say a solid 90% of the time it does sound like that. On occasion, there are some moments here, like the Only Heartbreaker, where Mitski actually adapts to that synth pop sound, and while she doesn't lose any quality in the tone of her voice or anything like that, she just sounds a lot more in her natural habitat here. And generally speaking, she does sound like her natural habitat with those moments, and theoretically, this should be her natural habitat if she were just willing to adapt slightly more to the style, but instead you have an indie rock singer and an indie pop singer singing synth pop, and while those are very, very closely related genres, especially indie pop and synth pop, considering they're subgenres of the same primary genre, I will say that they are far enough apart to at least be noticeable that this record could have been better had she changed her vocal style up slightly, at least. Unfortunately, I do think that this new sound has kind of put Mitski's lyricism on the back burner a little bit, so to speak, which is a shame because I do think that the most consistently great aspect about her music has been her songwriting over the years, and there are songs that have really strong writing on them that just sort of don't get focused on in terms of that lyricism, and sort of the focus is put on her vocals and instrumentals, which while good, don't match up to the level of quality that her songwriting is at, in my personal opinion at least. And the few moments here that do actually kind of at least semi focus on her lyricism, like on Love Me More, which is probably the only single off of this album that I truly thought was great, it's a highlight of the album. It really is just a genuine highlight of the record when her songwriting is focused on a bit more than it usually is, but generally speaking, the album just doesn't focus on her lyricism that much, if at all, sometimes her lyricism is just completely lost in the mix of things, not the literal mix, but the mix of everything happening in the record. And it's a shame because I do think that this record could have gone from a good album to a great album if we had just focused on her songwriting at least just a touch more. Overall, I think that Laurel Hell is not Mitski's best album by a long shot. There are some good synth instrumentals here, and I do think this album had a lot of potential, but I don't know. It's just her vocals aren't really that interesting and don't really change with the times changing of her instrumentals. Her songwriting is overshadowed by those instrumentals, and I do think overall it just nothing really kind of works out the way that I think it was planned to work out. But nonetheless, I do think this is actually a good album. I know it seems like I kind of was critical of this and didn't like it. I actually did enjoy it. I think it's a fun, pleasant synth pop album, but I do think by Mitski standards, it's a bit below the bar. But nonetheless, it's a good album. If you like synth pop, I'd recommend checking this out. I think it will ultimately be kind of a footnote in her discography in terms of quality. But if she continues to go in this direction, I think Mitski could genuinely eventually be on to something really, really great. So if she doesn't go back to the art pop of Be the Cowboy or that indie rock of the albums that came before it, I hope she continues to go in this direction instead of changing things up once again, because I think that with more practicing of the synth pop genre, Mitski could maybe make one of the better releases of the genre from recent years. So, yeah, with that being said, I'm going to give this 3.5 stars out of 5. A good synth pop record, not Mitski's best, definitely not. Maybe actually one of her weaker albums, but that's not really a big deal considering Mitski's had one of the most consistently great careers out of any solo artist in probably the 21st century thus far. So, yeah, I'm giving this album 3.5 stars out of 5. And with that being said, that's the end of this review, and I will see you guys in the next one.